It started in a quiet neighborhood in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a place where people smiled at each other, shared coffee, and believed their street was safe. No one could imagine that behind one apartment door lived a man whose name would one day shock the entire world. Jeffrey Dahmer. To his neighbors, Dahmer seemed strange, but harmless. He was polite, quiet, and always alone. Some said he was shy. Others thought he was just lonely. But behind that calm face was a darkness that no one could see. A darkness waiting to explode. Late at night, people in the apartment building often complained about a strange smell coming from his room. Dahmer would calmly explain, "It's just spoiled meat." Sometimes he said it was from his tropical fish that had died. The neighbors believed him. Because why wouldn't they? He looked normal. But what was really happening inside apartment 213 was beyond imagination. The man everyone ignored was hiding something terrifying. A collection of bones, photos, and body parts that he kept as trophies. Years earlier, Jeffrey Dahmer's life had already begun to spiral. As a teenager, he was fascinated by death. He collected dead animals, dissected them, and studied their insides. Teachers thought he was curious about science. In truth, Dahmer was drawn to control, to the idea of owning something that couldn't leave him. After his parents' divorce, Dahmer became completely alone. He started drinking heavily, skipping classes, and eventually dropped out. The loneliness turned into obsession. By the time he was 18, he had already committed his first murder. His first victim was Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker he picked up in 1978. They drank beer, talked, and hung out. But when Stephen tried to leave, Dahmer panicked. He didn't want him to go. In that moment of fear and desire, Dahmer hit him with a dumbbell and strangled him. Then, in complete shock, he dismembered the body and buried it in his backyard. He later said, "I didn't want him to leave. That's when I knew something was very wrong with me." For years after that, Dahmer tried to live a normal life. He worked in factories, joined the army for a short time, and even tried to stop drinking. But his inner demons never went away. Every time he looked at someone he found attractive, his thoughts turned dark again. By the late 1980s, Dahmer's urges had become uncontrollable. He began luring men to his apartment by offering them money for photos or drinks. Once they were inside, he drugged them. Some never woke up again. Neighbors noticed strange sounds, a drill, hammering, and sometimes screams. But every time someone asked, Dahmer smiled politely and said, "It's just my fish tank filter." No one suspected a thing inside his apartment. Dahmer was building what he called his private world. He took Polaroid photos of his victims, preserved skulls, and even kept their remains in his refrigerator. He wanted to create a companion who would never leave him, someone he could control completely. Dahmer later confessed that he didn't kill out of hate or rage. It was fear, the fear of being alone. But that fear had turned him into something monstrous. In 1991, everything started to fall apart. The strange smells, the noises, and Dahmer's nervous behavior were beginning to attract attention. But still, no one imagined what was truly going on. Police had even visited his apartment once after a teenager escaped his room, but Dahmer convinced them it was just a lover's quarrel. The officers left, leaving the boy behind, who became Dahmer as the next victim. That one mistake would haunt the police department forever. By July 1991, Dahmer's killings had become more frequent. He was losing control. He worked during the day, hunted at night, and lived in constant fear of being discovered. The walls of his apartment were covered with stains. The smell of chemicals filled the air, and yet he continued, driven by the same twisted loneliness that had followed him all his life. But fate was closing in. One night, Dahmer made a mistake that would end everything. He invited another man to his apartment. But this time, things didn't go according to plan. The man's name was Tracy Edwards. He noticed something off the moment he entered the apartment. There was a terrible smell, and the walls were filled with strange photographs. Dahmer tried to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back. He punched Dahmer and ran for his life, barefoot and terrified, straight into the street where he found two police officers. When they followed him back to the apartment, no one was prepared for what they were about to see. Inside the refrigerator was a human head. In the drawers, bones, and on the, well, dozens of photographs showing what Dahmer had done to his victims. One of the officers said later, it was like stepping into hell. That was the night Jeffrey Dahmer's secret world finally collapsed. When police entered apartment 213, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the darkest crime scenes in American history. The small, dimly lit room looked normal at first glance. A couch, a TV, and a few beer bottles on the table. But then, the smell hit them. It was a mix of chemicals, decay, and something else. Something they couldn't describe. Officer Muller walked toward the refrigerator. Inside, he found a human head, perfectly preserved. His partner froze. They both looked at Jeffrey Dahmer, who sat quietly on the edge of his bed, his hands behind his back, staring at the floor. The silence was heavy. Then Dahmer spoke softly. "For what I did, I should be dead." That single sentence sent chills through the room. When detectives arrived, they began searching the apartment. What they found was beyond nightmare. In the freezer, they discovered human hearts, limbs, and organs stored in plastic bags. Inside the closet, a large pot filled with acid and bones. On the wall, Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies, each one carefully labeled. Everything was there. The tools, the chemicals, the remains. It wasn't just a murder scene. It was a museum of horror. At the police station, Jeffrey Dahmer sat quietly, almost calm. When the detective asked if he wanted a lawyer, Dahmer shook his head and said, "I already know what I've done. I'll tell you everything." For the next 2 weeks, he confessed to 17 murders, one by one in shocking detail. He spoke without emotion, describing how he lured victims, drugged them, and what he did afterward. Detectives were horrified, but they couldn't stop listening. He told them about his first kill, Stephen Hicks, back in 1978, when he was only 18. Then Stephen told me in a hotel room. Then many others, all young men who vanished without a trace. Dahmer remembered each name, each face, and how he kept souvenirs, bones, photos, even skulls, because he didn't want to lose them. He said, "I never wanted them to leave. I wanted to keep them forever." Psychologists later called it a mix of loneliness, obsession, and control. But to the world, it was something else entirely, pure evil. Dahmer explained that he wasn't driven by hate or revenge. His side it was a need to possess. He didn't want to hurt people, he wanted them to stay. But in his twisted mind, death was the only way to make that happen. The police also found that Dahmer had experimented with human remains, trying to create what he called a zombie, a person who would stay alive but have no will of their own. He tried using chemicals, drills, and injections. Every attempt ended the same way in death. When the media learned what had happened inside that small apartment, the story spread like wildfire. News channels across the US called him the Milwaukee Monster. Reporters camped outside the police station day and night. Families of missing men came forward, fearing their loved ones were among Dahmer's victims. DNA tests soon confirmed their worst nightmares. The public couldn't understand how someone so quiet, so ordinary looking, could hide such evil for years, and no one noticed. Neighbors remembered complaining about the smell, but nothing was done. One neighbor said, "I thought he was cooking something rotten. I never imagined it was human." Even more shocking was how close the police had come to stopping him earlier. Just a year before his arrest, a 14-year-old boy had escaped Dahmer's apartment, drugged and bleeding. The police were called, but Dahmer convinced them. The boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend, and they left the boy behind. Hours later, that boy was dead. That single mistake became one of the biggest failures in police history. As investigators pieced together Dahmer's crimes, they realized the full horror of what he had done. 17 victims over 13 years, each killed, dismembered, and photographed. Some remains were dissolved in acid. Others were kept in the fridge. Dahmer himself showed no signs of insanity during questioning. He was calm, polite, even cooperative. One detective said, "It was like talking to someone about grocery shopping, not murder." When asked why he didn't stop, Dahmer simply said, "I tried to stop. I prayed for it to go away, but it never did." He described how alcohol helped him silence his guilt, until guilt no longer existed. He said the killings gave him comfort, a feeling of power he never felt before. But in the end, even that power faded. He knew he would be caught. In fact, he said he wanted it to end. By the time the confession ended, the detectives had hours of recorded interviews, each one darker than the last. The evidence filled more than 10 boxers. Photos, tools, skulls, and journals. The police called it the most disturbing case in Milwaukee's history. When the trial began, crowds gathered outside the courthouse. People held signs demanding the death penalty, but Wisconsin had no death penalty. The only punishment possible was life in prison. As the court prepared for sentencing, one question remained: was Dahmer truly insane or just evil? The night of July 22nd, 1991, started like any other for Jeffrey Dahmer. He brought home another man, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards. Just like the others, Dahmer offered him a drink, a movie, and his usual quiet smile. But Tracy quickly felt something was wrong. The smell was stronger than usual, and the apartment walls were covered with strange chemical stains. Then, he noticed a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner of the room, and inside, a smell that made his stomach turn. Dahmer tried to handcuff Tracy, but this time the plan failed. Tracy fought back. His fear gave him strength, and somehow he managed to escape. He ran into the street, half-dressed, shouting for help. 2 police officers saw him and stopped. When they followed Tracy back to Dahmer's apartment, they expected a simple domestic case. They were wrong. As soon as they entered apartment 213, the smell hit them, thick, rotten, and unforgettable. One officer opened the refrigerator door, and what he saw made him step back in horror. Inside was a human head, carefully stored like food. Moments later, the other officer found photographs of dismembered bodies inside a drawer. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't run. He didn't fight. I simply sighed in a calm voice. For what I did, I should be dead. The world finds out, news spread fast. Reporters, police, and shocked neighbors gathered outside the Oxford apartments. The truth was finally out. Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 17 young men over the years. He had done unthinkable things that showed how dark the human mind could go. Inside his apartment, police found human skulls and bones arranged like trophies, a freezer full of body parts, dozens of Polaroid photos documenting every crime, acid barrels used to destroy evidence. It was a nightmare that even the most experienced detectives had never seen before. During questioning, Dahmer spoke with chilling calm. He told the police exactly what he had done, as if he were talking about a normal day. S-I-E-D-N-T. Kill for hate or revenge, but because he wanted to keep people close, forever. It wasn't love, it was control, taken to the darkest extreme. The trial in 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer stood in court, facing justice. Families of the victims cried, shouted, and demanded answers. Dahmer showed little emotion. He pleaded guilty, but insane, saying his mind was broken, that he didn't know why he did it. But the court disagreed. The judge sentenced him to 15 life terms, over 900 years in prison. As he was led away, Dahmer said quietly, "I know my time will be short. I deserve whatever I get." The end of the monster. In prison, Dahmer seemed different. He read the Bible, went to church, and even told guards he was ready to die, but his crimes had made him a target. On November 28, 1994, another inmate, Christopher Scarver, attacked Dahmer with a metal bar in the prison bathroom. Moments later, the man who terrified the world was dead. Some called it justice, others called it karma. But one thing was certain: Jeffrey Dahmer's story would never be forgotten. The legacy, even today, people still ask, how could someone so normal-looking do something so evil? His case has become a warning, a reminder that monsters D&T always hide in the dark. Sometimes they live right next door, and behind every smile, every quiet neighbor, there might be a story we'll never fully understand.